world where royal blood determines destiny, one man's split-second decision changes everything. Edmund, a humble coachman with calloused hands and a servant's heart, never imagined that saving the queen from an assassin's arrow would thrust him into the deadliest game of secrets the kingdom has ever known. Now, caught between powerful nobles who would kill to protect their interests and a desperate queen who has entrusted him with a truth that could ignite civil war, Edmund must navigate a labyrinth of lies where every shadow hides a dagger, every whisper carries treason, and the fate of the entire realm rests on his next move. What price will he pay for loyalty? What sacrifice does honor demand? The answer lies within a secret so explosive that its revelation will forever change not just Edmund's life, but the very foundation of the kingdom itself. The wheels of the royal carriage groaned against the ancient cobblestones, sending tremors through the weathered wood as Edmund clutched the reins with calloused hands. His eyes, perpetually vigilant despite years of exhaustion, scanned the tree line bordering the lonely forest road. Something felt wrong. The birds had fallen silent too suddenly, and the shadows seemed to move against the wind. It happened in less than a heartbeat. The whistle of an arrow sliced through the autumn air, missing Queen Eleanor's exposed neck by mere inches. The deadly projectile embedded itself into the carriage's oak panel with a sickening thud that echoed through Edmund's very soul. Time slowed as he glimpsed the shadowy figure melting between the distant trees, already knocking another arrow. There was no time to think. Edmund's body moved before his mind could catch up. With a primal roar that tore from deep within his chest, he yanked the reins violently, driving the startled horses directly toward the assassin. The carriage lurched dangerously, nearly toppling as it crashed through the underbrush. The would-be killer's eyes widened in shock, clearly not expecting the humble coachman to transform into an avenging fury, before disappearing beneath the thundering hooves and splintering wheels. The silence that followed seemed to swallow the forest whole. Only the queen's rapid breathing and Edmund's pounding heartbeat remained, a frantic duet of life persisting against death's design. "My lady," Edmund gasped, leaping down from his perch with legs trembling not from fear, but from the flood of relief washing over him. "Are you harmed?" Queen Eleanor sat frozen, her alabaster skin even paler than usual, making the scattered freckles across her nose stand out like stars against a winter sky. Her hands clutched the edge of her seat, knuckles bleached white with tension. For a moment she seemed unable to speak, her royal composure shattered by the nearness of her own mortality. Then her eyes found his. In all his 43 years of existence, 30 of them in service to the crown, no noble had ever looked at Edmund the way Queen Eleanor did now. Not as a servant, not as a faceless commoner who existed merely to fulfill their whims, but as a man, a human being who had just saved her life. Tears welled in her eyes, transforming them into liquid sapphires that reflected his own stunned expression. Her lips trembled, parting slightly as if to offer thanks, but what emerged instead sent ice crawling down Edmund's spine. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the unnatural stillness of the forest. "You need to know the truth that no one else must hear." Edmund hesitated, suddenly aware of the vast divide between them, not just in station, but in worlds. Servants did not share secrets with queens. Yet something in her gaze pulled him forward until he knelt beside her carriage door, close enough to smell the lavender oil in her hair. "What I am about to tell you," she continued, her voice trembling like a leaf in autumn wind, "could destroy everything. The kingdom, the peace, all of it." Edmund's throat went dry. The weight of her words pressed against his chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe. He wanted to refuse, to climb back onto his perch and pretend this conversation had never happened. But it was too late. The queen's words had already become chains, binding him to whatever terrible knowledge she carried. "The true heir to the throne," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the empty forest around them, "is not living in the castle." Edmund's heart stumbled in his chest. "He lives hidden among the poor of the village. A child with royal blood who knows nothing of his birthright." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical thing, terrible and beautiful all at once. Edmund stared at her, searching for any sign of madness or deception, but found only raw, desperate truth in her eyes. "If anyone discovers this," she continued, her voice breaking, "the kingdom will descend into civil war. Thousands will die. The common people, your people, will suffer most of all." Edmund felt the world tilting beneath his knees. How could such a burden fall upon him? He was nothing. A coachman born to peasants, a man whose greatest achievement until today had been learning to read despite his station. Now, with a few whispered words, the Queen had placed the fate of the entire realm in his rough, unworthy hands. "Why tell me this?" he finally managed, his voice hollow with shock. Queen Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment Edmund glimpsed the vulnerable woman beneath the crown. Someone trapped by circumstances just as surely as any serf was bound to the land. "Because you risked everything to save me," she answered, "and because I have no one else left to trust." In the distance, the castle towers rose against the darkening sky, their stone walls gleaming gold in the fading sunlight. Once, Edmund had looked upon those towers with awe and reverence. Now they loomed like a promise of secrets, lies, and dangers he could scarcely imagine. The horses shifted restlessly, breaking the spell of the moment. Edmund rose slowly, his legs leaden with the weight of the Queen's revelation. "We should continue, Your Majesty," he said mechanically. "It isn't safe to linger here." She nodded, composing herself with visible effort. As Edmund climbed back to his seat, he realized with terrible clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The secret beat within his chest like a second heart, dangerous and alive. The carriage wheels began to turn once more, carrying them toward the castle where silence would become their only ally. Edmund's hands gripped the reins so tightly that his knuckles ached, but the pain was welcome. A small, tangible thing in a world that had suddenly become vast and treacherous. Behind him, carrying her impossible secret, sat the Queen. Before him, growing ever closer, loomed the castle with all its shadows and whispers. And somewhere, in a village Edmund had passed 100 times without a second glance, lived a child who could bring the entire kingdom crashing down. Edmund guided the royal carriage through the towering castle gates as dusk settled over the kingdom. The courtyard bustled with activity, servants scurrying about, guards changing posts. Nobles gathered in hushed conversations that ceased abruptly as the Queen's carriage approached. Word of the attack had somehow raced ahead of them, carried on the wings of rumor that always flew faster than horses ever could. "The Queen's coachman saved her life!" someone shouted as Edmund brought the horses to a halt. Several guards rushed forward, their faces a mixture of relief and heightened vigilance. They formed a protective circle around the carriage as Edmund climbed down from his perch, his legs still unsteady from the weight of the secret now lodged in his chest. He offered his hand to help Queen Eleanor descend, a customary gesture he had performed thousands of times before. Yet today, as her fingers briefly touched his, an invisible current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous bond they now shared. "Take the Queen to her chambers immediately," ordered the captain of the guard, his hand resting nervously on his sword hilt. "And you, coachman, the king will want to hear your account of this treachery." Edmund nodded, his throat suddenly dry. As servants led the Queen away, her eyes met his one final time, a clear warning in their blue depths. "Say nothing of what we discussed." The great hall was filled with nobles when Edmund entered, his rough woolen clothes and mud-splattered boots a stark contrast to their silks and velvets. Conversations died as he passed, replaced by contemptuous whispers and thinly veiled sneers. These were people who had never noticed Edmund before. Why would they? But now found themselves intensely curious about the lowly servant who had saved their queen. "Look at him," a portly nobleman muttered to his companion, loud enough for Edmund to hear. "Thinks himself important now, I wager. As if any peasant wouldn't have done the same out of duty. My money says he'll ask for a reward," his friend replied with a cruel chuckle. "A cottage, perhaps, or a daughter for marriage. They always want something, these commoners." Edmund kept his eyes forward, his face a mask of servile deference that he had perfected over decades of service. These nobles knew nothing of him, not his thoughts, not his character, certainly not the explosive secret he now guarded. Each contemptuous glance, each dismissive whisper was a reminder. He was a stranger in this world of power, an outsider holding the keys to a kingdom's fate. After recounting the attack to the king's council, omitting the queen's confession, of course, Edmund was dismissed with barely a word of thanks. The danger had been real enough, but to these men, he had simply performed his duty. No more remarkable than a hound chasing away a fox from the henhouse. Night had fallen completely by the time Edmund made his way to the stables, his temporary home when royal journeys kept him at the castle overnight. The familiar smell of hay and horses welcomed him, a small comfort in a day that had shattered his understanding of the world. He collapsed onto a pile of straw, exhaustion settling into his bones like winter frost. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the queen's face, heard her impossible words. The true heir to the throne lives hidden among the poor of the village. How could such a thing be? Who was this child? And why had the queen chosen to burden him with this knowledge? If anyone knows, not just I, but all of us will be lost, she had warned. The weight of those words pressed against Edmund's chest, making even breathing feel like a deliberate act. A rustling sound from the stable entrance jolted him upright. Edmund reached for the small knife he kept tucked in his boot, a habit from younger days when he'd traveled less secure roads. "At ease, Coachman," came a smooth voice from the shadows. "I come merely to talk." Lord Edric stepped into the pale moonlight filtering through the stable windows. The king's chief counselor was a slender man with calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. His reputation for cunning was matched only by whispers of his ruthlessness. "My lord," Edmund said, quickly rising and bowing his head. "How may I serve you at this late hour?" Edric circled Edmund slowly like a predator assessing its prey. "What a remarkable day you've had," he said, his voice deceptively casual. From humble coachman to the Queen's savior in one dramatic moment. Quite the elevation. "I did only what any loyal subject would do, my lord." "Indeed." Edric's smile tightened. "And yet, I find myself curious about what happened after the attack, during those precious minutes before you returned to the castle." Edmund's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his face carefully blank, years of servitude having taught him the value of an unreadable expression. "I attended to Her Majesty's comfort and ensured the assassin was no longer a threat, my lord. Then we continued our journey with haste. Nothing else." Edric's eyes narrowed slightly. No conversation of note. The Queen was surely shaken by her brush with death. People say remarkable things when faced with their mortality. The question hung in the air between them, seemingly innocent yet laced with deadly purpose. Edmund realized with chilling clarity that this was no casual inquiry. Edric suspected something. "Her Majesty was indeed shaken, my lord," Edmund replied carefully. She spoke little, beyond expressing her desire to return to the safety of the castle. Edric studied Edmund's face for several long moments, searching for any flicker of deception. The stable air grew thick with tension, punctuated only by the occasional shuffling of horses in their stalls. "You saw something on that road, didn't you?" Edric finally said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Something beyond a simple assassin." It wasn't a question. The deliberate phrasing sent ice through Edmund's veins. Did Edric know about the Queen's secret? Or was he fishing blindly, hoping Edmund would reveal something in his panic? "I saw only what I reported to the council, my lord," Edmund said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Edric's smile returned, cold and sharp as a winter blade. "Of course you did." He turned to leave but paused at the stable entrance. "Remember, Coachman, loyalty to the crown means loyalty to the truth. All of it." With those words hanging in the air like a promise or a threat, he disappeared into the night. Edmund sank back onto the straw, his body trembling with delayed fear. The first thread of a conspiracy's web had just tightened around him, and he knew with grim certainty that it would not be the last. Whatever game of power was being played in the shadowed corridors of the castle, he had unwittingly become a piece on the board. Sleep was now impossible. Edmund stared into the darkness, the Queen's secret and Edric's veiled threats colliding in his mind like storm clouds. He was a simple man caught between forces he barely comprehended, with no allies, no plan, and no escape. Dawn would bring new dangers, new decisions. But for now, In the quiet solitude of the stable, Edmund could only wrestle with the impossible choice before him: protect a queen's dangerous secret, or protect himself from those who would kill to discover it. Edmund woke to the sound of a servant boy calling his name, the first gray light of dawn barely filtering through the stable windows. Sleep had claimed him for only a few restless hours, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and whispered secrets. "The Queen requests your presence," the boy announced, his young face solemn with the importance of his task. "You're to come immediately. Her private chambers." Edmund's heart skipped a beat. The Queen's private chambers were forbidden territory for someone of his station. Servants whispered that even the king himself rarely entered that sacred space without invitation. "Are you certain?" he asked, brushing straw from his clothes. The boy nodded impatiently. "Lady Marguerite said you're to be escorted directly. No delays." Lady Marguerite, the Queen's most trusted handmaiden, was waiting for Edmund at the base of the eastern tower. Her pinched expression suggested she disapproved of summoning a commoner to the royal quarters, but she said nothing as she led him up the winding stone staircase. Each step carried Edmund further from the world he knew, deeper into the dangerous heart of the castle's intrigues. The Queen's private chambers were nothing like Edmund had imagined. Instead of opulent displays of wealth, the room was almost austere in its simplicity. Heavy tapestries covered the walls, not for decoration but for warmth against the perpetual chill of stone. Dozens of candles burned despite the morning light, filling the air with the sweet scent of beeswax and something more exotic: incense from distant lands, its smoke curling upward like ghostly fingers reaching for heaven. Queen Eleanor sat by the window, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, making her look younger and more vulnerable than the regal figure who ruled beside the king. When she turned at their entrance, Edmund was struck by the shadows beneath her eyes, evidence that her night had been as sleepless as his own. "Leave us," she commanded Lady Marguerite, who hesitated visibly before curtsying and backing from the room. The heavy oak door closed with an ominous thud, leaving Edmund alone with the Queen and the weight of yesterday's revelation hanging between them. "You spoke to no one?" she asked without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Your Majesty," Edmund replied, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "Though Lord Edric came to the stables last night. He asked questions about what happened on the road." The Queen's sharp intake of breath confirmed Edmund's suspicions. Edric was dangerous. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing of importance, Your Majesty. Only what was already reported to the council." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his weathered face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, for she gestured to a simple wooden chair across from her own. "Sit," she said, and when he hesitated, added more softly, "Please." Edmund perched awkwardly on the edge of the chair, acutely aware of the absurdity of his situation. A coachman sitting in the Queen's private chambers as if they were equals. The world had indeed turned upside down in the span of a single day. "You must understand," Queen Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What I told you yesterday wasn't merely a secret. It is treason in the eyes of many. If you trust me, you will remain silent. For the good of all." Edmund's throat tightened. "Your Majesty, I'm a simple man. I know nothing of court intrigues or matters of state. Why burden me with such knowledge?" "Because God put you on that road yesterday," she replied, her fingers nervously twisting the gold ring on her right hand. "Because you saved my life without hesitation, risking your own. And because I've watched you for years, Edmund. You're a man of honor in a place where honor has become rare." The use of his name startled him. He couldn't remember the Queen ever addressing him directly before yesterday, let alone knowing his name. "What would you have me do?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "For now, nothing," she said. "Keep the secret. Watch. Listen. Trust no one, especially Lord Edric." She rose then, moving to a small chest on a nearby table. From it, she withdrew a silk purse that clinked softly with the unmistakable sound of coins. "This is for your loyalty," she said, offering him the purse. "Silent rewards for silent service." Edmund stared at the purse, its weight representing more money than he might see in 5 years of service. The temptation to take it warred with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't merely payment for saving her life, It was the price of his silence, his complicity. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I serve the crown faithfully. I require no payment for doing my duty." Something like respect flickered in the Queen's eyes, but she pressed the purse into his hands regardless. "Then consider it protection. The roads ahead will be dangerous, and a man needs resources to navigate them." Her words carried a warning that chilled Edmund's blood. This was no simple secret. It was a storm that would eventually break over them all. As if reading his thoughts, the Queen's expression softened. Her hand, adorned with the royal seal ring, briefly touched his arm, a gesture so unexpected that Edmund nearly flinched. "If you trust me, keep silent," she implored, her voice thick with emotion. "For the good of all." In that moment, looking into her pleading eyes, Edmund made his choice. He would protect her secret, not for the gold in his hands, but because something in his heart told him it was right. Yet even as he nodded his agreement, a voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. What of the peasants struggling under harsh taxes? What of the hungry children in the village square, their gaunt faces watching nobility pass by in silken finery? If the throne belonged rightfully to another, was silence truly for the good of all, or just for the good of those who already held power? The Queen seemed to sense his internal conflict. "There is more at stake than you know," she said quietly. "More lives hanging in the balance than you can imagine." Before Edmund could respond, a bell tolled somewhere in the castle depths, signaling the changing of the guard. Their time was up. "Lady Marguerite will show you out through the servants' passage," the Queen said, her regal mask slipping back into place. "Remember? Trust no one." Edmund bowed deeply, the purse heavy in his pocket, and followed the handmaiden through a hidden door concealed behind one of the tapestries. As they descended a narrow staircase used only by servants, his mind raced with the magnitude of his decision. That very afternoon, the consequences of his choice began to manifest. Edmund noticed eyes following him in the courtyard, not just servants curious about his summons to the Queen's chambers, but guards watching his movements with suspicious gazes. Word traveled fast within castle walls, and his unusual access to the Queen had not gone unnoticed. When Lord Edric approached him again in the stables that evening, Edmund was prepared. The counselor's smile seemed friendly, but the cold calculation in his eyes betrayed his true nature. "A fortunate man you've become," Edric remarked, casually flicking a piece of invisible dust from his immaculate sleeve. "Summoned to the Queen's private chambers, a rare honor for a coachman." "I merely answered questions about yesterday's attack, my lord," Edmund replied, his face a careful mask of subservience. Edric's smile never wavered as he pulled a small leather pouch from his belt. The distinctive clink of coins echoed in the stable. "The crown values loyalty," he said, holding out the pouch, "especially when that loyalty extends to sharing information that might protect the kingdom." Edmund stared at the offered bribe, understanding exactly what Edric wanted, the Queen's secrets, whatever they might be. The choice before him was clear: accept the counselor's gold and betray the Queen, or refuse and mark himself as a target. "My lord is generous," Edmund said carefully, "but I've nothing to share beyond what was already reported." Something dangerous flashed in Edric's eyes. A predator denied its prey. The smile remained fixed on his lips, but it had transformed into something threatening. "Consider my offer," he said, returning the pouch to his belt. "Loyalties in this castle shift like sand beneath the tide. A wise man secures his position before the waves come." As Edric turned to leave, his parting words hung in the air like a physical threat. "I'll be watching you, Coachman. Everyone eventually chooses a side in this game, willingly or not." The stable door closed behind him, leaving Edmund alone with the realization that his first choice had not freed him from danger, but pulled him deeper into it. The path ahead was treacherous, lined with enemies he couldn't identify and allies he couldn't trust. His only certainty was that there would be no turning back. 3 days passed, each more suffocating than the last. Edmund felt eyes tracking his every movement. Servants who once greeted him warmly now fell silent when he approached. Stable boys who had sought his advice on horses suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The weight of the Queen's secret had transformed him into a marked man, though none could name what made him dangerous. "Thomas?" Edmund called to a stable hand who had been his friend for over a decade. The man glanced up from brushing a mare, his expression guarded. "Will you join me for ale tonight? It's been too long since we shared a drink." Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting nervously to the stable entrance before answering. "Can't tonight. Family matters." The lie hung between them, awkward and painful. Thomas had no family in the castle town. His wife had died years ago, and his children worked as servants in a nobleman's estate 2 days' ride away. This was the same man who had wept on Edmund's shoulder during those dark days, who had shared countless evenings over cheap ale and warm bread. "Another time, then," Edmund said quietly. The distance between them now measured in more than just physical space. He found similar walls erected wherever he turned. In the servants' quarters, conversation stopped abruptly when he entered. In the kitchen, where he had always been welcomed for a warm meal, the cook suddenly claimed food was scarce. Even in the tavern beyond the castle walls, where he sought refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the royal grounds, patrons shifted uncomfortably when he approached their tables. The isolation might have been bearable if it were merely social, but Edmund sensed something more sinister at work. Twice he caught the glint of armor from the corner of his eye, royal guards following at a discreet distance as he moved through the market square. Once, returning to the stables after dark, he discovered his few personal belongings had been searched, his worn leather satchel left slightly askew from how he had placed it that morning. Sleep became a luxury he could ill afford. Each night, Edmund moved his sleeping pallet to a different corner of the stables, never resting in the same place twice. He kept the Queen's purse hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the farthest stall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture and prying eyes. On the fourth morning, Edmund ventured into the crowded marketplace, desperate for a breath of normal life beyond the castle's oppressive walls. The autumn air carried the scents of fresh bread and roasting chestnuts. Merchants called out their wares, and for a moment, he could almost pretend that nothing had changed. He stopped at a fruit seller's stall, exchanging a copper coin for a ripe apple. As the merchant handed him the fruit, their fingers brushed, and Edmund felt something else pressed into his palm. A coin, but different from any he had ever held. Careful to keep his expression neutral, Edmund examined the object once he had moved a safe distance away. It was indeed a coin, but unlike the king's currency that circulated through the realm. This one bore an unfamiliar symbol, a crown bisected by what appeared to be a sword or perhaps a torch. He turned it over in his palm, wondering at its meaning. "The true heir lives among us," a voice whispered suddenly from behind. Edmund whirled around to find a stooped peasant standing uncomfortably close. The man's face was weathered by years of sun and hard labor, his clothes patched and worn, indistinguishable from dozens of other commoners in the marketplace. Before Edmund could respond, the stranger melted back into the crowd, leaving only his words echoing in Edmund's mind. A cold sweat broke across Edmund's brow. How could this man know? Had the Queen's secret already spread beyond their whispered exchange? Or worse, had it never truly been a secret at all? Questions churned in his stomach like sour milk as he made his way back to the castle, the strange coin burning like a hot coal in his pocket. If the knowledge of the true heir had already escaped the Queen's confidence, Edmund's position was even more precarious than he had feared. He was now caught between powers he couldn't identify, playing a game whose rules he didn't understand. That evening, as Edmund checked the horses one final time before seeking his own rest, a shadow by the stable door made him freeze. His hand moved instinctively to the small knife at his belt, but the figure stepped forward into the lantern light before he could draw it. "I bring no threat," said a soft voice, a woman, though her face remained hidden beneath a heavy hood. "Only a warning." Edmund's grip on his knife remained tight. "Show yourself," he demanded. The woman pulled back her hood just enough to reveal her face, one of the castle laundresses, if he recalled correctly. Not someone he knew well, but a familiar presence in the servants' quarters. "Speak quickly," Edmund said, glancing toward the stable entrance to ensure they remained alone. "What warning?" "You've made powerful enemies, Coachman," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The wrong ears hear everything within these walls. The wrong eyes see all. "I've done nothing wrong," Edmund protested, though the weight of the Queen's secret and the strange coin in his pocket made the words ring hollow even to his own ears. The woman's laugh was brittle, entirely without humor. "Innocence is no protection here. Only caution might save you." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, offering it with trembling fingers. "This was to be placed beneath your door tonight. I intercepted it." Edmund took the parchment warily, unfolding it to reveal a message written in a precise, elegant hand that spoke of noble education. "Betray the Queen and gain your freedom. Protect her, and you will lose everything." The blood drained from Edmund's face as he read the words. No signature marked the parchment, no seal indicated its origin. Just the naked threat, laid bare in ink and shadow. "Who sent this?" he demanded, looking up from the parchment. But the laundress was already gone, the stable door swinging gently in her wake. Edmund stood frozen, the threatening note clutched in his hand. The message confirmed his worst fears. This was no longer about choices made in private, about loyalty freely given or withheld. Unknown forces were closing around him, eliminating his options one by one. He moved to the lantern, holding the parchment to the flame. The edges blackened and curled, the threatening words disappearing into ash that scattered on the stable floor. But burning the message did nothing to erase the danger it represented. That night, Edmund lay awake on his pallet, listening to every creak of the ancient timbers, every rustling leaf outside the stable windows. The coin from the marketplace seemed to pulse beneath his pillow like a second heartbeat. The peasant's words, "The true heir lives among us," tangled with the Queen's confession and the anonymous threat, weaving a web of mystery that tightened around him with each passing hour. How had a simple coachman, a man who had spent his life in quiet service, become the nexus of such dangerous knowledge? Edmund had never sought power or position. His ambitions had been modest, a warm place to sleep, enough food to quiet his stomach, perhaps someday a small cottage of his own where he might spend his final years in peace. Now those humble dreams seemed impossibly distant, replaced by conspiracies and threats that reached to the very throne itself. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the stable windows, Edmund came to a grim realization. The secret he now carried was not merely a burden. It was a death sentence waiting to be executed. In choosing to protect the Queen, he had placed himself in the path of forces that would crush him without hesitation if it served their purpose. The question was no longer whether he would survive this game of shadows and whispers, but how long he might delay the inevitable, and whether in those borrowed days he might somehow uncover the truth behind the Queen's impossible confession. For if knowledge had made him a target, perhaps more knowledge, the full truth, whatever it might be, was his only hope of salvation. The castle that had once been merely Edmund's workplace had transformed into a labyrinth of whispers and sidelong glances. Rumors rippled through its stone corridors like wind through wheat, gaining strength with each retelling. Though Edmund kept to himself, fragments of gossip reached his ears nonetheless. Servants spoke of royal bastards, of ancient betrayals, of ghosts from the crown's bloodied past returning to seek vengeance. In the grand hall, where nobles gathered each evening to dine and scheme in equal measure, the air hung heavy with the sour scent of spilled wine and intrigue. Edmund, delivering a message to the master of horses, caught snippets of conversation that made his blood run cold. "The Queen keeps strange hours," murmured a baroness behind her jeweled fan. "Praying, she claims, but the chapel servants say her knees rarely touch the prie-dieu." "And what of the king's continued illness?" her companion replied, voice lowered but not enough. 10 years younger than his bride, yet aging 20 for her, everyone. Strange, is it not? They fell silent as Edmund passed, their painted smiles never reaching their predatory eyes. Once, such talk would have meant nothing to him. The idle speculation of bored nobility had been background noise throughout his years of service. Now, each whispered word seemed connected to the explosive secret he carried, potential pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble. The most disturbing development came during the weekly court assembly, where petitioners brought grievances and requests before the king. Edmund, attending as driver for an elderly member of the royal council, stood at the back of the crowded hall. The proceedings had been predictable, land disputes, tax complaints, minor nobles seeking royal favors, until a richly dressed merchant stepped forward. "Your Majesty," the merchant began, his voice carrying the confident tone of wealth, "I seek justice for a theft committed against my house." The king, looking frailer than Edmund remembered, leaned forward slightly. "Speak your grievance." 20 years ago, the merchant continued, something precious was taken from the kingdom, something of royal significance. A ripple of tension moved through the assembly. The queen, seated beside her husband, remained perfectly still, though Edmund, watching carefully from his position, saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the arms of her throne. "This is an unusual approach to a theft claim," the king said, his voice betraying a hint of impatience. "What precisely was stolen, and why bring this matter forward after so many years?" The merchant's smile was thin and knowing. "Because, Your Majesty, I believe the time has come for truth, for restoration of what was lost." Before he could elaborate further, Lord Edric stepped smoothly from his position beside the throne. "This sounds like a matter requiring private investigation rather than public court. Perhaps you would share the details with the royal investigators first?" The merchant hesitated, clearly disappointed at being denied his dramatic moment before the full court. Finally, he bowed stiffly. "As Your Majesty wishes." As guards escorted the merchant from the hall, Edmund noticed something that sent ice through his veins. The man wore a ring bearing the same strange symbol as the coin hidden beneath Edmund's sleeping pallet. The bisected crown was unmistakable, even from a distance. This was no coincidence. The merchant, the peasant in the marketplace, the mysterious coin, all connected to the queen's terrible secret. The knowledge of the hidden heir was spreading, transforming from whisper to bold declaration. And somehow, Edmund had become entangled in the center of it all. That evening, a commotion near the knight's quarters drew curious onlookers. Sir Roland, a young knight known for his loyalty to the queen, had been discovered unconscious in his chamber, a strange symbol carved into the wooden post of his bed, the same bisected crown that now haunted Edmund's waking hours. "Traitor's mark," whispered a kitchen maid as Edmund passed. "They say he carried messages for the queen, secret messages." "To whom?" asked her companion. The maid shrugged. "No one knows. But they found foreign coins beneath his mattress. Payment for betrayal, some are saying." Edmund quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs. The circle was tightening, not just around him, but around anyone connected to the queen's confidence. He needed to be more careful than ever. In the days that followed, Edmund became a ghost in his own life, present but unseen, listening but never speaking. He observed how nobles who once fawned over the queen now maintained a careful distance. How certain knights and guards exchanged subtle signals when royal commands were issued. How Lord Edric's influence seemed to grow with each passing day. Most troubling of all was how the common folk, the bakers, blacksmiths, and farmers who kept the kingdom functioning, had begun to whisper about bloodlines and succession. In the tavern where Edmund occasionally took his evening meal, he overheard two merchants discussing the matter with surprising frankness. "My grandfather served in the royal kitchens during the old king's reign," one said, his voice slurred by ale, but his eyes surprisingly sharp. "He swore until his dying day that something unnatural happened the night the queen first arrived at court. Something involving the royal bloodline." His companion scoffed. "Old men's tales grow taller with each retelling." "Perhaps. But have you noticed how the queen watches the common folk when she rides through the village? Not with disdain like the other nobles, but with searching eyes, as if looking for someone." Edmund's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He had indeed noticed this behavior during their journeys, how the queen's gaze would linger on certain young men in the village, particularly those of a specific age. He had attributed it to her well-known charitable nature, her concern for the common people. Now, in light of her confession, those searching glances took on a far more significant meaning. She wasn't merely observing the peasants, she was looking for her secret, for the true heir hidden among them. The following morning, Edmund was summoned to prepare the royal carriage for a journey to the outer villages. Such trips were routine, The Queen often visited the rural communities to distribute alms and hear petitions too minor for formal court. But as Edmund checked the harnesses and wheels, he sensed something different about this particular journey. The Queen arrived without her usual retinue of ladies-in-waiting, accompanied only by a single guard whom Edmund recognized as one of the few knights still firmly loyal to her. Her face was partially concealed by a hooded cloak despite the mild autumn weather. "We travel to St. Agnes Convent," she informed Edmund, her voice pitched low though no one else was present. "By the forest road, not the main highway." Edmund nodded, keeping his expression neutral though his mind raced. St. Agnes was a small, unremarkable convent, known primarily for its herb gardens and healing traditions. It lay in the opposite direction from the villages usually visited during these charitable journeys. As they departed through the castle's eastern gate, less used and less observed than the main entrance, Edmund felt the weight of unspoken purpose in every turn of the carriage wheels. This was no ordinary journey. He was certain of it. They were moving toward something significant, perhaps toward the very heart of the secret that had transformed his life. The convent's gray stone walls came into view just as the sun reached its zenith. Unlike the imposing grandeur of the castle or the wealthy monasteries that dotted the kingdom, St. Agnes presented a humble face to the world, simple, austere, easily overlooked. Perfect for hiding secrets, Edmund thought as he brought the horses to a halt before the modest wooden gates. The Queen disappeared inside for nearly 2 hours, leaving Edmund to tend the horses and ponder the growing mystery. When she finally emerged, her face was paler than before, her movements betraying a subtle urgency. "Return to the castle by the forest path," she instructed, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. "Stop for nothing and no one." They traveled in silence, the Queen lost in troubled thoughts, while Edmund focused on navigating the increasingly narrow forest trail. Neither noticed the rider following at a careful distance, visible only as fleeting glimpses of movement among the ancient oaks. By the time they returned to the castle, darkness had fallen. Edmund helped the Queen descend from the carriage, noticing how her hand trembled slightly in his. "You've served me well today," she said quietly. "Remember your loyalty when others seek to test it." With those cryptic words, she vanished into the shadowed corridor leading to her private chambers, leaving Edmund alone with questions multiplying like stars in the night sky above. Later that night, as Edmund settled onto his sleeping pallet in the stables, a soft footfall alerted him to an intruder's presence. His hand moved to his knife, but a familiar voice stopped him. "Be at ease," said Lord Edric, stepping into the faint moonlight filtering through the stable windows. "I come merely to satisfy my curiosity." The counselor's smile was pleasant, but his eyes gleamed with dangerous intensity. "An interesting journey today, was it not? The Queen rarely visits that particular convent." Edmund's mouth went dry. "I merely drive where I'm instructed, my lord." Of course. Edric waved a dismissive hand. "Though I wonder what business Her Majesty might have in such a humble place. Religious devotion, perhaps, or something more worldly." The question hung in the air between them, its true meaning clear despite the casual tone. Edric knew, or strongly suspected, that the Queen's journey had purpose beyond simple charity. "I wouldn't presume to know the Queen's mind, my lord," Edmund replied carefully. Edric studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You've become quite the diplomat, Coachman. A valuable skill, though sometimes dangerous when practiced by those of common birth." The threat beneath the observation was unmistakable. Before Edmund could respond, Edric turned to leave, pausing at the stable door. "Sleep well," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "Tomorrow promises to be a day of revelations for us all." Edmund woke before dawn, Lord Edric's ominous promise echoing in his mind. A day of revelations. Whatever the counselor had planned, Edmund couldn't afford to wait passively for it to unfold. After yesterday's journey to St. Agnes Convent, the pieces of this dangerous puzzle were beginning to align in ways that left him cold with dread. He moved through his morning duties mechanically, tending to the horses while his thoughts raced ahead. The Queen's unusual behavior, the mysterious convent visit, Edric's thinly veiled threats, all pointed toward a coming crisis. If Edmund hoped to survive whatever storm approached, he needed answers, not just fragments of a truth others seemed to already grasp. As luck, or perhaps fate, would have it, the opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. Lady Marguerite appeared at the stables just after midday, her perpetually pinched expression even more severe than usual. "The Queen requires your services," she announced without preamble. "Immediately." Edmund followed the handmaiden through a series of servants' passages, expecting to be led to the royal carriage. Instead, they wound deeper into the castle's maze-like interior, finally emerging in a secluded courtyard Edmund had never seen before. A small door in the outer wall stood open, revealing a narrow alley that led toward the town beyond. "The Queen awaits at the east gate," Lady Marguerite whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Go alone and tell no one of this summons." Before Edmund could question her further, she pressed a sealed letter into his hand and vanished back into the shadows of the castle. The letter bore no royal seal, only a simple wax closure marked with the now familiar symbol of the bisected crown. His heart hammering against his ribs, Edmund tucked the letter inside his vest and made his way through the alley. The east gate was the least used of the castle's entrances, primarily serving as access for farmers bringing produce from the outlying fields. At this hour, it stood nearly deserted save for a single hooded figure waiting beside a modest cart. As Edmund approached, the figure turned, pulling back the hood just enough to reveal the Queen's face. She looked different somehow, stripped of royal finery, dressed instead in the simple garb of a merchant's wife. She appeared both younger and more vulnerable. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't certain you would." "Your Majesty, what—" She cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Not here. We ride to St. Agnes. All will be explained there." The journey passed in tense silence, the Queen driving the humble cart herself, while Edmund sat beside her, acutely aware of how exposed they were without royal guards or proper escort. Anyone might attack two seemingly ordinary travelers on the forest road: bandits, wolves, or something far more dangerous. Those who had threatened to make this a day of revelations. They reached the convent as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. Unlike their previous visit, this time the Queen led Edmund directly to a small side entrance where a nun awaited, her weathered face revealing nothing as she ushered them quickly inside. "Sister Agnes?" The Queen greeted her with obvious familiarity. "Is he here?" The elderly nun nodded solemnly. "In the herb garden, as you requested. No one will disturb you there." Edmund followed the two women through stone corridors that smelled of beeswax and dried herbs, his confusion mounting with each step. Who was this mysterious he they were meeting? What connection could a humble convent possibly have to the explosive secret of a hidden heir? The herb garden was enclosed by high stone walls, creating a peaceful sanctuary from the outside world. Neat rows of medicinal plants stretched in orderly patterns, tended by a solitary figure bent over a patch of lavender. At their approach, the figure straightened and turned. Edmund's breath caught in his throat. Standing before them was a young man, no more than 17 or 18 years of age, with features that struck Edmund like a physical blow. The boy's eyes were the same distinctive shade of green as the king's, set in a face that echoed the royal portraits hanging in the castle's great hall. Even his stance, the way he held his shoulders, bore the unmistakable stamp of royal bearing despite his humble clothing. "Your Majesty," the young man said, bowing deeply to the Queen. "Rise, Thomas," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "There's someone I wish you to meet." The Queen turned to Edmund, whose mind was still reeling from the implications of what stood before him. This was no abstract secret, no political whisper. This was a living, breathing young man who carried royal blood in his veins, the true heir she had spoken of. "This is Edmund," the Queen said to the boy. "The coachman who saved my life, and the only man outside these walls who knows of your existence." Thomas studied Edmund with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond his years. "Sister Agnes speaks highly of you," he said. "She says you chose loyalty when others would have chosen advantage." Edmund struggled to find his voice. I don't understand. How can this be? The king has no acknowledged sons. No acknowledged sons, the queen corrected gently. Thomas was born before my marriage to the king. When his father took the throne, powerful forces at court demanded that all threats to succession be eliminated. The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Edmund had heard whispers of such practices in other kingdoms, bastard children quietly disposed of to secure a clear line of succession. But to see living proof of such a secret, preserved against all odds. Instead of allowing such a crime, Sister Agnes interjected, her voice surprisingly strong for her frail appearance. The queen brought the infant here where he has been raised in safety and ignorance of his true heritage. Until recently, Thomas added, a shadow crossing his young face. 3 months ago, on my 17th birthday, Sister Agnes revealed the truth of my birth. Edmund's gaze shifted between the 3 figures before him, the queen, the nun, and the boy who should have been a prince. Why tell him now? Why take such a risk after all these years of secrecy? The queen's expression darkened. Because others have begun to uncover what we've hidden. Lord Edric has spies everywhere, even here among the Holy Sisters. The symbol you've seen, the bisected crown, belongs to those who believe the throne should pass to its rightful heir, not to the king's cousin who currently stands next in line. A movement has been growing among certain nobles and common folk alike, Sister Agnes explained. They call themselves the True Line, and they seek to place Thomas on the throne. Edmund felt as though the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unstable. And you, Your Majesty? What do you seek? For the first time since he had known her, the queen's composure cracked entirely. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the boy who might have been her stepson in another life. I seek his safety, she whispered. If you take him from here, the kingdom will descend into civil war. Lords will choose sides, armies will clash, and the common people will suffer most of all. But if you leave him in ignorance, a false king will rule, while the true heir tends herbs in obscurity. Edmund finally understood the full weight of what had been placed upon his shoulders that day on the forest road. This wasn't merely about keeping a queen's confidence. It was about the fate of an entire kingdom, about choosing between bloody truth and peaceful lies. If I may speak, Thomas said quietly, drawing all eyes to him. I have lived 17 years without a crown or castle. I have known kindness here, and purpose. The throne is my birthright, they tell me. But what king would begin his reign by spilling his subjects' blood? There was wisdom in the young man's words that struck Edmund deeply. Here was no power-hungry pretender, but a thoughtful soul who understood the human cost of claiming his inheritance. The choice cannot be yours alone, Sister Agnes told Edmund gravely. But know this. If Lord Edric discovers Thomas's existence, he will stop at nothing to eliminate the threat. Already his agents search the villages, following rumors and ancient gossip. Then why reveal this to me? Edmund asked, the question that had plagued him since the Queen's first confession finally escaping his lips. Why burden a simple coachman with knowledge that could topple a kingdom? The Queen stepped closer, her gaze intense despite the tears still shining in her eyes. Because when you saved my life, you proved yourself a man of instinctive courage and honor. Because sometimes, Edmund, fate places the greatest burdens on the most unlikely shoulders. She took his hand in both of hers, a gesture that would have been unthinkable days ago, a queen touching a commoner as an equal. I need someone I can trust completely, someone Edric would never suspect. I need you to help me protect him, even as forces gather to place him on a throne that would likely become his scaffold. Edmund left the convent garden with his head spinning, the weight of impossible choices pressing down upon him. The Queen had given him no time to answer, no moment to refuse this dangerous honor. Instead, she had simply said, "Return to the castle, consider what you've seen. We will speak again when the time is right." As their humble cart approached the castle's east gate, Edmund caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows. Lord Edric, his cold smile visible even at a distance. The counselor's parting words from the previous night echoed in Edmund's mind. Tomorrow promises to be a day of revelations for us all. Somehow, despite all their precautions, Edric had known. The game was moving faster than any of them had anticipated, and Edmund stood at its center with no clear path to safety, For himself, for the queen, or for the boy who should have been king. A week passed in eerie calm, the stillness before a storm that Edmund could feel gathering force with each passing day. The queen had not summoned him again, and he had seen her only from a distance during court ceremonies, her face a careful mask revealing nothing of their shared secret. Yet the castle hummed with tension, servants whispering of strange comings and goings, nobles forming tight clusters in corridors that fell silent when others approached. Then came the unexpected announcement. The king would hold a special court assembly in 3 days' time. Rumors spread like wildfire through every level of the castle. The aging monarch, rarely seen in recent months due to his mysterious illness, would address matters of succession. Some whispered that he meant to name his cousin as official heir. Others claimed more dramatic announcements were forthcoming. Edmund knew better than to join in these speculations. He kept to his duties, eyes down, ears open, waiting for whatever machination Lord Edric had set in motion to reveal itself. The counselor had been suspiciously absent since spotting Edmund and the Queen returning from St. Agnes, which only heightened Edmund's sense of impending disaster. On the morning of the assembly, Edmund was assigned to drive an elderly baron from his country estate to the castle, a routine task that should have kept him safely on the periphery of the day's events. But as they approached the castle gates, the baron tapped Edmund's shoulder with his walking stick. "You'll attend me inside, Coachman," he ordered, his rheumy eyes surprisingly sharp. "My legs aren't what they once were." Edmund had no choice but to obey, though every instinct warned him to flee in the opposite direction. The great hall was already crowded when they entered, nobles in their finest attire, knights in polished armor, clergy in formal robes. Edmund helped the baron to his designated place among the lesser nobility, then retreated to stand among the guards at the back of the hall, partially hidden in shadow. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire assembly without drawing attention to himself. The throne dais stood empty, awaiting the royal couple. Courtiers arranged themselves in their complex hierarchy of importance, a living map of power and influence that Edmund had learned to read over his years of service. Most tellingly, Lord Edric's usual position remained vacant. The counselor was nowhere to be seen. A trumpet blast announced the royal entrance. The crowd parted as the king shuffled forward, leaning heavily on a jeweled cane. Edmund barely suppressed a gasp. The monarch had deteriorated dramatically since he'd last seen him. His face was ashen, his once powerful frame now stooped and frail. Beside him walked the queen, her expression serene though her eyes darted constantly, surveying the crowd with barely concealed anxiety. "My loyal subjects," the king began once seated, his voice surprisingly strong despite his weakened appearance. "I have summoned you to witness changes to the royal succession that will secure our kingdom's future prosperity." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Edmund noticed several knights subtly shifting positions around the hall's perimeter, hands resting on sword hilts. The baron he had driven to the castle exchanged meaningful glances with a cluster of older nobles to his right. "My years grow short," the king continued, "and Providence has not blessed our union with children." He gestured toward the queen, who remained perfectly still, her gaze now fixed on some middle distance. "Therefore, after consultation with my advisors and with divine guidance, I have decided to name my cousin, Lord Harrington, as heir apparent to the throne." The expected announcement produced a polite ripple of applause, but Edmund sensed an undercurrent of tension beneath the formal response. This was not unexpected news. Why the special assembly? Why the heightened security? Something else was coming. The king raised his hand for silence, but before he could speak again, a commotion erupted at the hall's entrance. Lord Edric strode forward, flanked by 4 royal guards. His face wore the triumphant expression of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey. "Your Majesty," he called, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent hall. "I beg your indulgence before this succession is formalized. A matter of grave importance has come to light that bears directly on the future of the crown." Edmund felt his heart seize in his chest. This was it, the moment Edric had been building toward. Somehow the counselor had obtained proof of Thomas's existence. The queen's face had gone deathly pale, though she maintained her rigid composure. The king frowned, clearly displeased at the interruption. Speak then, Lord Edric, but be aware that my patience grows thin with these theatrical displays. Edric bowed deeply, a gesture that somehow managed to convey mockery rather than respect. Your Majesty, for too long, dark secrets have been kept from you and from this court. Secrets that, when revealed, will change the very foundation of our succession. He gestured sharply, and one of his guards stepped forward, unrolling a parchment. I have here documented evidence, sworn testimony from 3 witnesses, that your wife, our queen, has been engaging in treasonous activities. Gasps echoed through the hall. The queen's hands gripped the arms of her throne, her knuckles white with tension. Edmund fought the urge to step forward, to shout a denial. Any action would only confirm his connection to whatever Edric was about to reveal. The queen has been secretly visiting St. Agnes Convent, Edric continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Not for prayer or charity as she has claimed, but to conspire with enemies of the crown. The king turned to his wife, confusion and betrayal warring in his eyes. Is this true? Before she could answer, the queen suddenly slumped forward in her throne, a heart-wrenching sob escaping her carefully maintained composure. I cannot bear this burden any longer, she cried, her voice echoing through the stunned silence. The crown belongs to another blood. The hall erupted in chaos, nobles shouting questions, guards stepping forward with hands on weapons, clergy calling for order. Edmund stood frozen in horror. The queen had broken under pressure, confessing before the entire court. Any moment now she would reveal Thomas's existence, and the kingdom would descend into the civil war she had feared. The king rose shakily to his feet, his face contorted with shock and rage. What madness is this? Speak plainly, woman. Before the queen could respond, Lord Edric stepped forward, a scroll unfurled in his hands. I have the answers your majesty seeks, he announced, his voice cutting through the tumult. This document contains the full confession of Sister Agnes, who has harbored the queen's secrets these many years. Edmund's blood ran cold. If Edric had gotten to Sister Agnes, then Thomas was already in grave danger, or worse. He scanned the hall desperately, looking for any ally, any possible escape from the disaster unfolding before him. Just as Edric prepared to read from his damning document, the king raised his hand in a gesture that instantly commanded silence. To everyone's astonishment, he pointed directly at Edmund. You, the king said, his voice ringing with unexpected authority. The queen's coachman. Step forward. Edmund felt every eye in the hall turn toward him. Legs suddenly leaden, he forced himself to move through the parting crowd until he stood at the foot of the dais, surrounded by enemies with nowhere to hide. Your Majesty, he managed, bowing deeply to hide the terror in his eyes. I am told, the king said, his voice carrying clearly through the deathly silent hall, that you have been privy to the queen's confidences, that you have accompanied her on these suspicious journeys, that you, a mere servant, might know more of this matter than the lords of my council. Edmund's mind raced. Who had informed the king of his involvement? Had the queen herself revealed his role during some private interrogation? Or had Edric been watching him even more closely than he realized? Is this true? The king demanded. Do you know the meaning of the queen's outburst? Edmund raised his eyes to meet the king's gaze, then glanced briefly at the queen. Her face was a mask of despair, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Behind her stood Edric, triumphant anticipation gleaming in his cold eyes. In that moment, Edmund understood that everything, the kingdom's future, Thomas's life, his own fate, hung on what he would say next. The great hall held its collective breath, hundreds of eyes fixed upon the humble coachman suddenly thrust into the center of a royal crisis. Edmund felt the weight of each gaze like a physical pressure, the silence so complete he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. This was what the queen had meant when she spoke of fate placing burdens on unlikely shoulders. This moment, this impossible choice, had been hurtling toward him since that arrow missed the queen's throat on the forest road. Now it had arrived, and there was nowhere left to hide. Your Majesty, Edmund began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. I stand ready to speak what I know to be true. Time seemed to slow as Edmund stood before the assembled court. the weight of countless lives resting upon the words he had yet to speak. The massive hall, with its soaring stone arches and ancient tapestries, had fallen into a silence so complete that the distant call of birds outside the castle walls seemed intrusive. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows across expectant faces, nobles hungry for scandal, guards tensed for violence, servants frozen in breathless anticipation. Edmund felt oddly calm now that the moment of decision had arrived. The path behind him had been a maze of secrets and fears, but the choice before him suddenly appeared with crystal clarity. He could confirm the Queen's outburst, exposing Thomas as the true heir and likely igniting a civil war that would ravage the kingdom. Or he could deny everything, condemning the young man to eternal obscurity while preserving a peaceful, if fraudulent, succession. Truth or peace, justice or mercy. The choice of kings, now thrust upon a coachman. "Your Majesty," Edmund began again, his voice gathering strength with each word, "I have indeed accompanied the Queen on many journeys, including visits to St. Agnes Convent." Lord Edric's smile widened fractionally, victory gleaming in his cold eyes. The Queen's shoulders slumped further, as if Edmund's words had added physical weight to her already overwhelming burden. "In all those journeys," Edmund continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled court, "I witnessed a woman of profound compassion and unwavering devotion, both to your Majesty and to the people of this realm." Confusion flickered across Edric's face. This was not the testimony he had expected. The Queen's visits to St. Agnes were indeed for a purpose beyond simple prayer, Edmund acknowledged, feeling the tension in the room sharpen like a blade. She went to oversee the care of orphan children, those left without family by war, disease, and hardship. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the scandalous revelation they had anticipated. Her Majesty has, for years, supported these children from her personal treasury, Edmund continued, the lie flowing easily from his lips. She has ensured their education, their health, their future prospects, all without seeking recognition or praise for her generosity. The king's eyes narrowed suspiciously. This does not explain her outburst about the crown belonging to another blood. Edmund took a deep breath. Here was the precipice, the moment that would determine everything that followed. He glanced once more at the Queen, whose tear-streaked face now showed the first flicker of hope, then turned fully to address the king. "Your Majesty, I am but a simple man. I was born in a village not 5 miles from this castle, the son of a blacksmith who taught me that our worth lies not in the circumstances of our birth, but in the choices we make and the compassion we show to others." Several nobles shifted impatiently, but Edmund continued undeterred. His gaze moved from the king to sweep across the entire assembly. "I have served the crown for 30 years. I have driven carriages bearing lords and ladies who never bothered to learn my name. I have witnessed feasts in this very hall while children starved in the streets beyond these walls. I have seen gold spent on tournaments and palaces while villages struggle to rebuild after floods and fires." A dangerous murmur rose from the assembled nobility. Such criticism from a commoner was unprecedented, perhaps even treasonous. But Edmund had moved beyond fear now. "When Her Majesty speaks of another blood, I believe she speaks of us, the common people whose sweat and toil sustain this kingdom, whose taxes fill the royal coffers, whose sons die in Your Majesty's wars, whose daughters serve in noble houses. Blood that is no less worthy, no less valuable, no less deserving of consideration when decisions are made that affect all our lives." The murmur grew louder, but Edmund raised his voice to be heard above it. "I cannot speak to matters of succession or politics. Such things are beyond my station. But I can speak to what I have witnessed with my own eyes. A queen who weeps for children not her own, who listens to the concerns of farmers and blacksmiths as attentively as she listens to dukes and barons, who believes that true nobility lies in service to others rather than in titles and lands." Edmund turned back to the Queen, whose tears now flowed freely, though her expression had transformed from despair to something like wonder. "I believe Her Majesty's conscience has been troubled by the distance between those who rule and those who are ruled, by decisions made in marble halls that bring suffering to thatched cottages, by the knowledge that the crown, symbol of authority and protection, sometimes forgets its obligation to those beneath it. The hall had fallen silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, thoughtful, perhaps even chastened. Edmund could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in the current of power flowing through the room. The king studied Edmund's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he turned to Lord Edric. "Is this the great conspiracy you promised to unveil, Counselor? A queen with a conscience? A royal wife who concerns herself with the welfare of our poorest subjects?" Edric's face had darkened with fury. "Your Majesty, this servant clearly lies to protect his mistress. The documents I have are no doubt as twisted and misleading as your ambition." The king interrupted, strength returning to his voice. "I have watched you, Edric, gathering power like a miser hoards gold. Did you think me too ill to notice? Too weak to act?" The counselor stepped back, shock replacing his previous confidence. "Sire, I have only ever served the crown. You have served yourself," the king said flatly. "Guards, escort Lord Edric to his chambers. He is relieved of his duties pending a full investigation of his conduct." As the stunned counselor was led away, the king turned back to Edmund. "As for you, Coachman, you have shown uncommon courage today." It is not often that kings hear plain truth spoken without fear or flattery. He glanced at his wife, his expression softening. "Perhaps I have been too long isolated from the realities of my kingdom, too willing to delegate my responsibilities to men like Edric." The queen rose slowly from her throne and moved to stand beside her husband. "Forgive me, my lord," she said, her voice still trembling but growing stronger. "My heart has been heavy with the suffering I have witnessed. I should have brought my concerns to you directly, rather than bearing them alone." The king took her hand, a surprisingly tender gesture from a man known more for his military victories than his compassion. "Together we will do better," he promised, before turning back to address the full court. "Let this day mark not just a formal declaration of succession, but a renewal of our commitment to all our subjects, noble and common alike. The crown belongs not to a single bloodline, but to the kingdom itself, to all who dwell within our borders and look to us for justice and protection." As the king continued to address the court, outlining reforms that would ease the burden on the common folk while maintaining the stability of the realm, Edmund quietly backed away. His role in this drama was complete. The crisis had passed. The queen caught his eye as he retreated, gratitude and something deeper, respect, perhaps even friendship, evident in her gaze. In the weeks that followed, whispers of the true heir faded like morning mist under the rising sun. Thomas remained at St. Agnes, his identity still known only to a precious few. The queen continued her visits to the convent, now openly acknowledged as charitable work rather than secret conspiracies. And if she spent extra time with a certain young gardener, teaching him about statecraft and justice alongside his studies of herbs and healing, few thought to question it. Edmund returned to his duties as royal coachman, outwardly unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted within him and within the kingdom itself. The distance between throne and stable had narrowed, not through revolution or bloodshed, but through simple human truth spoken without fear. Months later, as Edmund drove the royal carriage through a village market, a peasant woman approached to offer the queen a simple bouquet of wildflowers. As the queen accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, Edmund caught the woman's eye and recognized her, the laundress who had warned him of danger that night in the stables. She smiled slightly, then pressed a familiar coin into his palm, the bisected crown that had once represented a dangerous conspiracy. But now, polished and attached to a simple chain, it had been transformed into a symbol of something else entirely. The bridge between two worlds, the recognition that true nobility existed in unexpected places. The queen had not given him titles or lands or formal recognition for his service. Instead, she had given him something far more valuable, the knowledge that a single voice, speaking truth in a moment of crisis, could change the course of a kingdom. Edmund closed his fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, no longer a burden, but a reminder. Sometimes the humblest hands carried the greatest treasures. Sometimes the simplest words held the deepest wisdom. And sometimes, just sometimes, fate placed the greatest burdens on the most unlikely shoulders not to crush them, but to reveal the strength that had been there all along. Sometimes the most profound acts of heroism come not from those born to power, but from ordinary hands that rise to extraordinary moments. Edmund's journey reminds us that true nobility has never been about bloodlines or titles, but about the courage to stand for what is right when everything within us screams to remain silent. What would you have done in his place? Would you have chosen truth that brings chaos, or peace built upon lies? In life's defining moments, we rarely have perfect choices, only impossible ones that reveal the essence of who we truly are. Edmund chose compassion over ambition, wisdom over power, and in doing so, changed not just his own destiny, but reshaped an entire kingdom. His story teaches us that even the humblest voice, when speaking truth with conviction, can echo louder than the roar of armies or the proclamations of kings. If this tale moved you, if it made you question what you might sacrifice for what you believe, then share it with someone whose heart needs reminding that history's course is often changed not by those who sit upon thrones, but by those who quietly serve with integrity. Subscribe to hear more stories that will challenge your heart and awaken your spirit, because the most powerful stories are those that continue to live within us long after the telling is done.